Daar word baie berig oor die feite dat die BRICS-lande, waarvan Suid-Afrika een is, 'n moontlikheid oorweeg vir hulle eie geldeenheid. En hierdie week het ons ook natuurlik gehoor in die nuus dat Donald Trump gesê het hy sal dan 'n 100% tarief teen hierdie lande toedien of aandien en sal dit realiseer. En vanoggend gesels ons met Harry Scherzer en hy is van Future Forex om meer daaroor te gesels. Good morning, Harry.
Good morning, Jennifer. How are you?
Good, and you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us this morning. I think it's very important to speak about this. And let's start with the reality of the BRICS countries really actually forming their own currency. Do you think it will ever happen?
Yeah, Jennifer, in my view, it is highly unlikely. I think if you look at the closest example to a set of countries forming a currency, you've got the euro in Europe. And there were a lot of issues with doing that, but the sets of countries in Europe are far more homogenous in the way their economic conditions are, their people are, than Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So practically, it would be almost impossible in my view.
It's not just that, it's also geographically, you know, those countries are right next to each other. We've also heard, like you said, it wasn't all glamorous getting the euro. We often hear about bailing out certain countries, and if you think economically, even just where South Africa's at, you know, the reality of bailing out another country or the other countries bailing us out, it seems quite impractical.
No, absolutely. And imagine when you have to make decisions like monetary policy. Do you increase interest rates, decrease interest rates? Well, now you've got to look at the set of individuals that it's affecting. But when you're affecting people halfway across the world who have different economic needs and economic conditions, it would be so difficult. And can you imagine sort of Russia wanting one thing, South Africa wanting another, and now Ramaphosa and Putin have to fight in different directions for where this currency goes? It's not practical. In my view, it's never been practical. And I understand the sentiment to remove reliance on the dollar, but it just feels too far away from being practical.
One thinks of the politics of it and the ideological differences when it comes to just the basic economic models of the BRICS countries. They are not similar by a long shot. So if you think about that in itself, the one thing that might be a universal feeling is the fact that the BRICS countries would all like to lessen the dependency on the dollar, maybe. Is that maybe it?
Yeah, that's exactly the driver. The driver here is that the global currency is the dollar. And so right now, when a business in South Africa and a business in, let's say, Russia, again, are trading, they would quote in US dollars often. And that's what we're trying to get away from, is the strengthening of the dollar via our own countries interacting. And so in order to remove this dependency, they wanted to make a currency which is used within the BRICS nations and almost moves away from the dollar. So that's exactly right. The whole intention here is to reduce reliance on the global superpower that is America and on the dollar.
So let's pretend there is a currency. The BRICS countries get together and they form a currency, and Donald Trump decides, okay, well, 100% tariffs on these countries. How would that affect trade?
Jennifer, it would be a disaster. It would be an absolute disaster. I mean, can you imagine if everything was double as expensive from America for South Africa, for example? So now you have a situation where our second biggest trading partner and the country that gives us the AGOA agreement is doubling prices on everything. It would be a disaster for the rand. And I think Donald Trump knows this, and that's why he's put in place this threat of tariffs to basically force our hand. Now, of course, if tariffs were put on, it wouldn't only be bad for South Africa, it would also be bad for America. It's bad both directions. But Trump's playing the game and saying, right, it's worse for South Africa and worse for BRICS nations than it is for America, given America's relative size and given that it won't affect America as heavily. And so because of that, he's almost forcing the hand of the BRICS nations and being a little bit of a bully in truth, but a bullying strategy that forces the BRICS nations into only one decision, which is to stop implementing this immediately.
Harry, the implication of the BRICS countries trading with each other without deferring to the dollar, the consistency in Forex, just the risk, the inconsistency and the volatility inherent in the Forex there. I mean, the real versus the yuan and the rand. the Brazilian and then Chinese and South African. I mean, how would you stabilize that?
Well, this is exactly why the dollar is used, right? Is because of the inconsistency. If we're going to quote in rands and the rand devalues against the Indian rupee, let's say, suddenly the cost differs and you can't have that stability. So this is why the dollar is used, because the dollar is seen as the most global, the biggest safe haven, and basically the currency that's used for pegging stability. And so the question of how do you hedge against that, or how do you stabilize that? Well, there are a few ways that this can be done. The first is via something called forward exchange cover, which Future Forex offers as one of our offerings, whereby you can lock into a rate upfront for an international transaction that's going to happen in the future. So if you know you're going to buy stock in 6 months' time, you can lock into the rate right now for what you will pay in 6 months. And that's definitely going to be helpful. But it still is more volatile than using the dollar. And so for that reason, what I do believe, though, is that countries like South Africa and, let's say, India should be quoting in rands, should be quoting in rupees. They shouldn't be quoting in dollars. And that's the way of reducing this reliance from the dollar without having to form a BRICS currency. I do understand that there's more risk there. I do understand that the variations, as you pointed out, Pierre, are larger in that regard. But I think it's a necessary change to reduce this reliance on the dollar, particularly given the political viewpoint of the BRICS nations.
Yeah, and I suppose the political viewpoint of South Africa particularly, and our support for countries that are in the BRICS grouping. It is interesting, this whole situation, to see how reliant the world still is actually on America and the gold standard, which they measure against. Harry, thank you so much for your time this morning. We really appreciate it. It just gives us a better idea of the realities of a BRICS currency and whether that would happen or not. So thank you so much for your time this morning.
Yeah, thanks very much. Great to chat to you and Pierre.